Have you ever wondered why, at times, it seems that God allows pain to invade our lives? It may seem counterintuitive, but what if I told you that this pain, which we so often avoid, can be the instrument God uses to shape your greatness? Yes, that's right. While many believe that suffering is just a punishment or a burden to be carried, the truth is that in many cases, it is the path to spiritual growth and preparation for something extraordinary. And the most surprising, when we understand this, we begin to see suffering in a new light, as a means of purification, of character development, and of bringing us into a deep dependence on God. Think about it. The greatest characters in the Bible, those who have achieved incredible feats, have not lived a pain-free life. Rather, it was through afflictions that they became who God called them to be. Now, here's the question that few dare to ask. What if your suffering, the pain you feel today, is part of a larger process that God is orchestrating to prepare you for a great mission? Sounds controversial, doesn't it? But the truth is that pain can be the fuel God uses to forge leaders, transform lives, and bring us closer to Him. Throughout this video, you will understand exactly how God uses pain to set the stage for greatness. It's not about enduring suffering without purpose, but about seeing how God is using every painful moment for your good. Isaiah 48:10. God, with unparalleled wisdom, uses suffering as a spiritual furnace. It is like the refinement of gold. The intense fire removes all impurities and reveals the hidden brilliance. Likewise, the pain we face on a daily basis is not without purpose. It works to mold and purify our character. When you look at difficulties through this lens, you can see that each obstacle has the potential to be a catalyst for deep transformation. Imagine the process of a potter creating a vase. He applies pressure, adjusts, sculpts, and then puts the piece in the oven. Only after facing the extreme heat, that vessel becomes strong and capable of fulfilling its function. We are that vessel. The pressures of life are God's tools to transform us into something stronger and more useful. If you are going through a phase of suffering, know that, like the vessel, you are being prepared for something greater. This is the essence of spiritual growth. Many times we try to run away from pain, but it is at this moment that dependence on God intensifies. When we are at our limit, with no human solutions in sight, we realize that our strength comes from Him. A practical example of this is when we face a loss. Instead of resisting, we can give ourselves to prayer, seeking strength and guidance. It is in this surrender that God acts in a more visible way, purifying us and guiding our path. Think pure gold. It only reaches its most valuable state after being exposed to high temperatures. The same logic applies to our lives. The suffering that seems unbearable now may be what will unleash your greatest potential. Many times we think we won't be able to stand it, but it is precisely at this moment that perseverance begins to form. It's like a marathon runner. The pain in his body makes him think about giving up, but each step brings him closer to the destination. In Scripture, we see countless times God using pain to transform lives. Remember the story of David. It was forged in the midst of challenges and persecutions. God didn't just mold him in comfort, but through intense battles. This means that even in the most painful situations, there is a purpose. Pain may seem meaningless, but it always carries with it a valuable lesson, and the sooner we recognize it, the sooner we experience the spiritual growth it provides. Do you know when you have to study for a difficult test? The pain of preparation, the hours sacrificed, the exhausted mind, all of this prepares you for a pivotal moment. In the same way, the pain you face now may be preparing you for something that only God knows. It not only purifies you, but prepares you for a future that is beyond your current understanding. Pain is often the sign that there is something great being drawn. Suffering also teaches us complete dependence on God. When all human doors close, we are forced to seek the solution where it really is, in Him. A simple example: someone who loses a job may see it as total destruction, but by looking to God for direction, they can discover new paths, untapped talents, and even opportunities they would never have imagined. The same occurs in deeper issues, such as relationships or health. And at the end of every process, there is always growth. Spiritual growth does not come without pain, and purification does not occur without sacrifice. But just like the gold that shines after fire, you will come out of this furnace of suffering stronger, purer, and better prepared for the challenges that will come. And this purification is only the beginning of the journey. But there's more to understand about how suffering shapes character. Let's move on. Romans 5:3-4. When we go through tribulations, the suffering feels overwhelming. But as Paul reminds us in Romans 5, there is a hidden purpose. Tribulation produces patience, and this patience results in character and hope. Pain is like a spiritual academy. Just as the body is shaped by physical exertion, the spirit is strengthened by the trials we face. Every difficulty has the potential to transform you as long as you choose to persevere. Let's think of life as a long journey. Each bump in the road can be a reason to give up, or it can be seen as an opportunity to develop stamina. Suffering forces us to seek in God the necessary strength to continue walking. And as you do so, something amazing happens. You discover a strength you didn't even know you had. Persevering in the midst of chaos is like discovering a muscle you didn't know existed. Look at anyone who has excelled in life, spiritual or secular. They have something in common. They have all gone through suffering and trials. Consider the example of Job, who even in the midst of his worst pains maintained his trust in God. Suffering forged in him an unshakable character. In the same way, every difficult time you go through is working to shape something precious within you, a steady, persevering, rock-like character. Perseverance is not simply enduring pain, but learning from it. Think of the story of Thomas Edison, who failed hundreds of times before inventing the light bulb. Each attempt was not a failure, but a learning experience that brought him closer to his goal. Suffering, when faced with faith, does the same for us. He teaches us lessons we wouldn't learn otherwise. Perhaps it is time to start facing difficulties with this perspective. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to face crises with admirable calm? This does not happen by chance. It is the result of a long journey of trials that, when overcome, generated an unshakable trust in God. Perseverance helps us trust in the divine plan, even when we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. The character that develops in the midst of suffering is like a hidden treasure, revealed only to those who do not give up. If suffering brings with it the development of patience, that patience in turn results in experience. In other words, what you go through today prepares you for tomorrow's challenges. Just as an athlete must face the discomfort of training to improve his performance, the Christian must go through tribulations to reach spiritual maturity. When we face pain with our eyes fixed on purpose, we are building not only endurance, but also a character shaped by faith. The interesting thing is that this perseverance brings with it something precious: hope. A hope that does not depend on the circumstances around us, but on something much greater. When you understand that God is in control, the fear of the future dissipates. You begin to see that no matter how hard the trials are, they are leading you to something much better. The hope that arises from perseverance is like a beacon that guides you through the storms, and hope, once formed, never disappoints. It is an anchor for the soul, keeping you grounded even when everything around you seems to fall apart. The suffering you face today is building in you a solid, unshakable foundation. And that's just the beginning. For if perseverance begets character, and character begets hope, what else can suffering teach us about dependence on God? There is much more to learn. Hebrews 12:6. Discipline is an expression of love, and this may seem counterintuitive at first glance. When we experience pain and challenges, we tend to question why God allows such things to happen. However, as Hebrews 12:6 reminds us, the Lord chastens whom he loves. Just as a parent corrects his child to shape his character and ensure that he follows the right path, God allows us to go through difficult situations to prepare us for the greatness that is to come. Imagine a demanding coach who pushes his athlete to the limit. At first, the athlete may think that the coach is too harsh, but deep down, he knows that this pressure is necessary to achieve maximum performance. In the same way, God, in his infinite wisdom, disciplines us not to destroy us, but to strengthen and prepare us. Every correction, every obstacle is a learning opportunity, and with that, we grow both spiritually and in character. Divine discipline can often seem unjust or even harsh. However, if we look at the lessons it provides us, we will see that they direct us to a path of spiritual growth and dependence on God. A practical example of this is when we face a complicated financial situation. This forces us to rethink our choices, seek wisdom in resource stewardship, and most of all, trust that God will provide. Pain, in this case, teaches us to be more careful and disciplined in our actions. If you've ever gone through times when you felt lost, not knowing where to go, you may be trying one of these disciplines. God, in his goodness, sometimes allows us to lose our way temporarily, just so that we can find the right path again. It's like a student who needs to fail a test to learn how to study better. Discipline humbles us, teaches us, and ultimately makes us wiser and stronger. It is important to remember that discipline never comes without a purpose. Every moment of pain, every reproach, every loss is an invitation from God to a deeper relationship with him. Just as parents correct their children with love, God disciplines us so that we can be better versions of ourselves. When we accept this discipline with humility, we become more open to the transformation he desires to bring about in our lives. You may wonder why God does not spare us from certain sufferings, but the truth is, without discipline, we could never attain the spiritual maturity necessary to fulfill our purpose. Think of the story of Moses, who was shaped by God's discipline through years in the wilderness before leading his people to freedom. God always has a greater plan, even when we don't understand the corrections he sends us. Discipline also teaches us to depend on God in all areas of life. When everything seems to be out of control, we learn to surrender our worries and burdens to him, trusting in his will. God never disciplines us out of malice, but rather to mold us and prepare us for the journey ahead. This process can be painful, but it brings with it growth and unwavering faith. And so, discipline, when accepted with an open heart, bears fruits of righteousness. It not only corrects us, but empowers us to move forward with a new perspective. And this leads us to reflect on another great lesson that God teaches us through pain: how suffering can prepare us for great things. There is more to be understood about this. Genesis 50:20. Joseph's story is one of the greatest examples of how God uses suffering to mold character and prepare a person to fulfill a grand purpose. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, betrayed and unjustly imprisoned, Joseph could have sunk into despair. But instead, he persevered and allowed God to guide him even through the darkest of times. The pain he experienced prepared him for something greater: saving nations from starvation. Joseph faced many challenges, from imprisonment to humiliation, but he never stopped depending on God. He did not allow suffering to consume him. On the contrary, Joseph used these experiences to grow spiritually and develop an even stronger faith. And it was precisely in the midst of these trials that God positioned him to lead. This shows us that suffering can be the fertile ground where great leaders are formed. If we look at Joseph's life, we realize that every twist and turn seemed to push him further away from his dreams, but in fact, it was taking him closer to his destination. Often, the same happens to us. When we are facing adversity, we may feel like we are being led astray, but God is using these experiences to position us exactly where we need to be. Joseph, from slave to governor, is living proof that God uses even evil to do good. A practical example of this is when we face difficulties at work or in our relationships. We may think we are being wronged, but perhaps God is preparing us for something greater. In the same way that Joseph was prepared to rule through pain, our trials may be preparing us to lead, influence, and bless others. It is not uncommon for great difficulties to come great responsibilities. Interestingly, Joseph never rebelled against God, even when there seemed to be no way out. He trusted the process, believing that God was in control of his life, and this unwavering confidence was what allowed him to see the fulfillment of the dreams that God had placed in his heart. Suffering, far from being an obstacle, became the key to the realization of the divine purpose in his life. When we look at our own lives, we can see parallels with Joseph's journey. How often do we feel like we're facing challenges that seem unfair or unbearable? Like Joseph, we must learn to see suffering not as a punishment, but as a preparation. Pain is a refinement, and perseverance during these times strengthens us for what is to come. Spiritual growth often happens when we are at rock bottom. The trials Joseph faced served not only to save him, but to save many others. Suffering prepared him to lead with wisdom, compassion, and total dependence on God. Perhaps the pain you are facing now is preparing you to help others later. God uses our experiences to shape us, and just as Joseph saved nations, you may be called upon to impact lives in ways you can't yet imagine. And so, at the end of Joseph's journey, we see that all the suffering was worth it. What his brothers had planned for evil, God transformed into something great. It makes us reflect on how the trials in our lives can be used for the greater good. But there is even more to understand about the role of suffering in the divine plan. Job 23:10. Job is one of the most profound examples of suffering in the Bible. He lost everything, his health, his family, and his possessions. But in the midst of all this chaos, Job kept his faith firm in God, declaring that despite all his trials, he would come out like refined gold. His story shows us that God often allows suffering to test and strengthen our faith, and at the same time, he reveals his sovereignty, reminding us that he has control over all things, even when everything seems out of order. When looking at Job's life, it is striking to see how he never cursed God, even when everything around him was falling apart. He understood, on some level, that his suffering was not in vain, that God had a higher purpose. This lesson is essential for all of us. We won't always understand the reasons behind our pain, but we can trust that God is working for our good, even when all seems lost. Dependence on God is the key to getting through times of tribulation. There are times in life when we feel that we are being tested beyond our strength. Job experienced this sensation deeply. But what makes his story so remarkable is that in the midst of his suffering, he continued to trust in God. He didn't find immediate answers, but he kept the faith, knowing that God was refining his soul. This teaches us that when we face suffering, perseverance and faith are our greatest weapons to resist and eventually come out stronger. Job also teaches us about humility before God. He, a righteous man, was reduced to dust, and yet he understood that God was greater than his circumstances. Sometimes suffering comes to show us that we are not the center of the universe and that our lives are in the hands of someone far greater. This complete dependence on God, which Job demonstrates, is one of the most transformative aspects of suffering. When we learn to submit to divine sovereignty, we begin to see life in a different way. If we think about our modern life, we can see parallels with the story of Job. How many times do we feel that we are facing insurmountable challenges, that our prayers seem to go unheard? Job lived it, but he clung to the truth that God knew exactly what he was doing. Similarly, when we face illness, loss, or financial problems, we can choose to trust that God is refining us and that this suffering is shaping us into something greater. Job's suffering reminds us that God does not owe us explanations. He is sovereign and acts according to his perfect will. And that's something that's hard to accept, especially when we're going through moments of deep pain. But when we accept this truth, we find peace. Like Job, we can learn to rest in the assurance that at the right time, God will bring restoration and healing. Suffering is never the end of history. It is only part of the process of spiritual growth. By the end of his journey, Job had not only regained all that he had lost, but he had been blessed in an even greater way. This shows us that as we persevere through suffering, we are rewarded in ways we can't even imagine. Spiritual growth, unwavering faith, and dependence on God are the true treasures we find during our trials. Perhaps what you are going through now is a prelude to something great that God is preparing in your life. The story of Job teaches us that suffering, when faced with faith and perseverance, reveals God's sovereignty and refines us like gold. But there is even more to be explored about how suffering can teach us to depend even more on God. 2 Corinthians 12:9. When Paul cried out to God to remove the thorn in his flesh, the answer he received was simple but profound. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. It is in this moment of weakness and suffering that we are forced to stop trusting in ourselves and finally to depend totally on God. Suffering brings us to our knees, but it is in this posture of humility that we find the strength that comes from above. Pain, then, becomes a gateway to divine grace. Life is full of moments when we are reminded of our fragility. Whether it's illness, financial loss, or emotional problems, these experiences force us to recognize that we don't have control over everything. And that's where dependence on God comes into play. When we stop struggling with our limitations and surrender our weaknesses to Him, we begin to see how His strength is manifested in our lives. The secret is not to resist the pain, but to learn to trust God more in the midst of it. A practical example of this can be seen in the daily struggles we face. When something unexpected happens, such as the loss of a job, the first reaction is usually to try to figure it all out yourself. But as the doors seem to close, we realize that we need to surrender the situation to God. It is at this moment that we see the true power of dependence. Prayer becomes our first weapon, and faith sustains us when all other solutions fail. This not only gives us peace, but also brings us closer to God. Often, society teaches us to be independent and self-reliant, but suffering teaches us the opposite, that we are completely dependent on God. Paul understood this in his own life. He was a man of great abilities, but God brought him to a place of weakness so that he could experience divine power in a more intimate way. Suffering, therefore, is not a sign of defeat, but an invitation to trust more deeply in the grace that God offers us. If we look around, we will see examples of people who have found in pain an opportunity to draw closer to God. Think of someone who has faced a serious illness. Often, it is at this moment that faith intensifies. They find themselves forced to depend completely on God, and in the midst of pain, they experience His peace and provision in a real and tangible way. This teaches us that even in the darkest situations, there is a purpose, and that purpose is to lead us to trust our Creator more. Weakness is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. It is in weakness that we see how strong God is. It's as if when we're pushed to our limits, He finally has room to act in our lives. Dependence on God frees us from the false sense that we can control everything and gives us the assurance that He has a greater plan. When we begin to live with this dependency, the suffering no longer seems so overwhelming. In times of great pain, you may be tempted to think that God is far away, but the truth is that He is closer than ever. Suffering brings us to a point where the only thing we have left is God, and that's when we realize that He is all we need. When you place your weakness in His hands, grace flows abundantly. The pain that seems so unbearable now can be the path to deeper fellowship and unwavering faith. Weakness, then, becomes a bridge to God's grace, and the more we depend on Him, the more His strength is manifested in our lives. But in addition to weakness, suffering also prepares us in unexpected ways, as it did in David's life. Psalm 119:71. David, one of Israel's greatest kings, was not born prepared for the throne. On the contrary, he was shaped by the pain and afflictions he faced throughout his life. At Psalm 119:71 he says, "It was good for me to have been afflicted, that I might learn your statutes." The pain he experienced was a crucial part of his preparation, not only as a leader, but as a servant of God. Every battle, every persecution, and every moment of loneliness served to strengthen their dependence and obedience on the Lord. Before becoming king, David spent years on the run from Saul, facing enemies and dealing with betrayals. These experiences taught him about perseverance and faith. God used these afflictions to mold him into a man after His own heart. The suffering he went through was the furnace where his character was purified, preparing him to lead a nation with wisdom and compassion. David not only endured the pain but learned from it, and that is a lesson we can all apply to our lives. If you look at David's life, you'll realize that God didn't take him directly to the throne. He had to go through a process. A practical example of this can be seen in our own lives. Many times we want to achieve our goals quickly and without obstacles, but God puts us in a process of preparation. The pain we face today may be the training we need to prepare us for something greater. It is in the wilderness that character is shaped, and it was in the wilderness that David became the great leader he would become. It's easy to get lost in the midst of suffering and wonder, why is this happening to me? David likely asked this question several times while fleeing from Saul. However, he did not allow circumstances to separate him from God. On the contrary, he drew even closer to the Lord. In the midst of grief, he composed some of the most beautiful psalms, showing his dependence and trust in God. This example teaches us that pain can be a channel of intimacy with God, where we find comfort and wisdom. David faced the physical and emotional pain of battles and betrayals, but he never stopped trusting that God was in control. He understood that even in the midst of afflictions, God had a plan. This is something we can apply to our lives. When we face challenges, it's easy to focus solely on the pain. But we must remember that God may be preparing us for something much greater. Pain can be the hammer that sculpts our life, preparing us for a purpose we can't yet see. Often, it is in pain that we learn true obedience. When everything is going well, it's easy to follow God. But it's in times of distress that our faith is really tested. David learned this firsthand. His affliction taught him to obey and trust in God's promises, even when circumstances said otherwise. This process of learning through pain is something we all face at some point, but just like David, we can come out stronger on the other side. David also teaches us that pain does not last forever. He went through many afflictions, but he was exalted at the right time. God used David's pain to prepare him, but he also honored him for his perseverance and obedience. It reminds us that the suffering we face today will not be the end of history. God has a purpose in everything, and He is faithful to fulfill His promises at the right time. The affliction you are experiencing right now may be the prelude to something much bigger in your life. Just as David was shaped by pain to become the king Israel needed, every suffering we face has a greater purpose. But beyond that, there is an even grander example of suffering, one that shows us the way to future glory. 1 Peter 4:13. The greatest example of suffering in the Bible is that of Christ. Jesus, being perfect, faced unimaginable pain, both physical and spiritual, for the sake of humanity. He suffered not for His own sins, but for ours, and that suffering opened the way for redemption and future glory. In 1 Peter 4:13, we are encouraged to rejoice in sharing in Christ's afflictions, because present suffering does not compare to the glory that will be revealed in us. Christ, through His pain, showed us the way to eternal life. Jesus, during His ministry, never promised that His followers would be exempt from suffering. In fact, He said that we would be persecuted and go through afflictions. However, He has also given us hope that just as He was resurrected and glorified, so will we. The suffering we face in this world is not without purpose. It molds us into the image of Christ and prepares us for eternal glory. This gives us the strength to persevere, knowing that just as Christ overcame, we too will overcome. The cross was the greatest symbol of pain and humiliation that anyone could face. However, it was through this cross that Jesus brought salvation to all of us. What seemed to be a humiliating defeat, in fact, was the greatest victory in history. Christ's suffering is a constant reminder that pain, when lived with purpose, can be turned into glory. It teaches us to see our own afflictions in a new light. They can be the path to something much greater than we can imagine. In our lives, we face many challenges that make us question why God allows so much pain. But when we look at the example of Christ, we understand that suffering is not the end, but part of the path to redemption. Jesus, in His humanity, felt every pain we face: loneliness, betrayal, loss. However, He remained steadfast, trusting in God's plan. Similarly, we can face our sufferings with faith, knowing that our pain is aligned with a greater purpose. Christ suffered so that we might have life. He was rejected, humiliated, and crucified. But at no time did He lose sight of the purpose for which He came into the world. What does this teach us? That we must look beyond immediate circumstances and trust that God has a plan that goes beyond our comprehension. Every suffering we face here on earth is temporary and is preparing something far greater, the future glory that will be revealed when we are in His presence. A practical example of this is when we face rejection for our faith, or are criticized for following Christ. This can be painful and make us question the reason for so much suffering. But by remembering Jesus' example, we are strengthened to move forward, knowing that He too went through these things and emerged victorious. We are not alone in our struggles. Christ has already walked this path for us and gives us the strength to persevere, always with our eyes turned to the glory that is to come. And we must not forget that Christ's suffering also offers us an incomparable hope. He not only suffered and died, but He rose again and was glorified. This resurrection is the guarantee that just as He conquered death, we will also overcome. Present suffering is only a passing stage that leads us to eternal life. Hence, we can endure trials with courage and faith, knowing that a far greater reward awaits us. In short, Christ's suffering teaches us that pain is not the end, but the prelude to glory. He invites us to follow His example, to persevere through hardship, and to trust in God's plan. And with that perspective, we are ready to face any affliction, knowing that the future glory that awaits us is indescribable. And with that in mind, we reflect on the value of suffering as a tool of preparation for something much greater. Now that you understand how God uses pain to prepare you for greatness, the question that remains is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Will you continue to resist suffering, or will you choose to see it as an opportunity for spiritual growth? The transformation you desire may be right in the middle of the pain you are experiencing right now. What God has shown you today is the first step towards a real and profound change in your life. So, I ask, are you willing to trust that the present affliction is preparing you for something greater? The time has come to act. Pain is inevitable, but growth is optional. What are you going to do differently from today? How will you use this experience to strengthen your faith and draw closer to God? Let go of resistance and allow suffering to shape you. And most importantly, start now. Take advantage of this new understanding and apply it to your daily life. If this message spoke to your heart and helped you see things differently, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have so much more to share, and you won't want to miss the next teachings that will continue to transform your journey of faith and spiritual growth. God is just starting something big in your life, and I'll be here to guide you on that path.